Hello, today I would like to go through how to create a strategy basically, because what I'm looking at here, I think this is GTO with a pot size donk, like in position strategy, and GTO strategy when nobody is donking. As we see, when people are not donking, people should be checking a lot. They should be checking, let's say, 60% of the time compared to 47.5 if they do have a donking strategy. And I started with this particular flop, 11 big blind, straight possible, because I knew that GTO would be donking on this particular structure. Pretty intuitive, I think. And depending on if they donk or not, we should change our c-betting strategy, basically. Anyways, yeah, so I want to go over just how to create your own strategy in this video. And so my topic that I want to research and spend a lot of time learning during, let's say, between the second half of July and the first half of August, I wanted to research straight possible flops in heads-up limp pots at relatively shallow stacks, but not super short, but like 11 big blinds deep, basically. So that's the topic I chose. I thought it's kind of interesting, and I have now finished running all the sims, and now it's time to go in and start doing the research and learning all about the boards, basically. So yeah, but first let's talk about how I created the strategy. So how did I create it? And basically here we see GTO, whether there's a donking strategy or not. In position has an extremely complicated strategy, It's using all the bet sizings at some frequency. Overbets are very rarely used, only 2%, but between min bet, three-quarter pot, and full pot, like all sizings are used kind of at a relatively even frequency. Maybe the full pot is used slightly less, but not much less. And so I really needed to ask, like how can I simplify this? Because this is just so difficult to remember. Like, I can't remember to bet a quarter of the time with each sizing with a hand like 10-7 or Jack-7, whatever. It's just not possible to remember that stuff as a human being. And so I looked into the rounding. Maybe that would help. And whilst the rounding does help quite a lot, so I was using 25% rounding, and now I'm using 100% rounding. And whilst the rounding does help a substantial amount to simplify the strategy, I don't think it's applicable in this situation, just because our overall c-betting range changes so much. So before, we were c-betting like 40% of the time or something. Now we're c-betting like less than 30% of the time. Over here, we're c-betting 40%. Oh no, sorry, we were c-betting even over half the time here, I believe. Like without rounding. Yeah, we're c-betting over half the time, even with 25%. With 25%, it's not going to change dramatically. It's only a 1% change. So 25% rounding is good on these complicated boards, basically. Or on, like, if you want to make it kind of simple, but not too simple, basically. So here, we're c-betting 40% of the time without rounding. And with rounding, we would be c-betting 20% of the time, or like 17% even. So you see, there's really a massive difference. So I don't think it's practical either to use rounding on these particular flops, basically. So I think the only way to simplify our strategy is basically pick one or two sizings, and I think that's relevant to all boards. We want to pick one or two sizings on flop, and actually on most flops, one sizing is best. The ace-high boards, button versus big blind, is, let's say, more of an exception. There are very few board structures where we want to be using board structures and positions where we want to be using like more than one sizing basically on the flop. And I don't think even on like these straight possible boards, I don't think there's actually a use to be using more than one sizing, especially in a limped pot, heads up 11 big blinds. It's going to happen often. Like, we want to simplify our strategy as much as possible. So I think one big blind or 1.5 or two big blinds is best. And we need to figure out how to use it, basically. So anyways, another way to simplify is obviously to remove donking for outer position. If we look, this should be donking's GTO's donking range if he's using a 2 big blind donk. So I didn't even include all the donk sizings here. But anyways, basically, like these first few GTO sims, they take a really long time to do also because you've got so many more nodes basically. And it's going to take like double, triple the amount of time to solve compared to if you just had one or two sizings. So it's also impractical in that way to be using multiple sizings, just because you save time doing the sims. And so the first question I wanted to ask was, do I even want to have a donking range? Like, yeah, GTO has a 19% donking range here, but do we actually want to use it? I mean, what's the point? Like, what is the EV comparison? So let's see, the EV comparison is going to be like 0.852 for who's out of position here. It would be, yeah, out of position is player 1 and 0.38838. So it's like 2% difference, or almost 2% difference already on the flop. And I think that's already a relatively big difference already on the flop. This is one of the bigger differences you can find on the flop already, in my opinion. So already the EV is in differential is indicating that yes, we do want to have a donking strategy. The next thing I wanted to look at, obviously, is again, what are the checking ranges? So if they are checking, if c-betting ranges. So if we're donking, they should check about half the time. If we are never donking, they should check more than half the time. And if we look at in-position strategy, like, I don't really see people betting King 2 off that often. GTO is betting, a lot of gut shots, like over half of the gut shots, basically. GTO is betting almost every 7. I think people might do that. I don't really think they bluff enough with hands like 9-8, 10-8, although they might sometimes bluff too much with like Queen 9 with a backdoor flush draw or something, which they should be almost pure checking, for example. So they're more like just 2 overcards kind of bluffs. I think they'll have enough of, but it might be constructed wrong, basically. But I definitely don't think people are bluffing enough with like King 2, even Queen 2. And we see, and so in general, and like, okay, if we don't have a donking strategy, they can check back much more. Like, they should be checking back 7-2, which people are checking back 7-2, I think. People might check back 8-7 sometimes. if we are donking, they should always be betting every 7, basically. They will be checking back more of these 2 overcard type of hands. So I think they actually play better against us if we don't have a donking strategy in general, just because I think, I mean, one mistake they'll make, right? One mistake they might make is they'll still be betting all the 2 pairs, but it doesn't even make that big a difference. Like, if we look at 2 pairs in sets, I mean, it's really not that big a difference. Still betting most 2 pairs, even against a no donking strategy, and still betting like 75% of sets. Here it's only half the sets that are betting. So it's like a very little difference regarding the top range still. Straights bet at the same frequency. So overall, I do feel like they are betting like they're betting correct amounts basically against people who do not donk. But they're betting too little against people who do donk, I find. Like if we look at ace high and king high types of hands, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. But I do still think they check back. I think a lot of people would check back king 10, king jack, king queen, even ace queen quite often, whereas here king queen and king jack, king 10 are betting at relatively higher frequencies. I also think people are almost pure checking king deuce. Like I don't see people bet king deuce here almost ever. And again, that will favor having a donking strategy. What else? So, like, we can quickly look at just, air. Let's start with the draws, with like the straight draws here. So with straight draws, I think people will be checking kind of like this. They'll be betting more like 50-50 rather than 70-30 or something. We see like, just pure gut shots and no additional equity. They're betting like about half the time here or more. Here it's more like 25 to 50%. Here it's 50 to 75%. Here it's 25 to 50%. So I think again they're betting more like 50%. So they're slightly under betting. Again favoring donks. We can look at backdoor flush draws and backdoor straight draws. So don't think there's too big a difference there. Yeah, that doesn't matter. And then finally the pure air is like the most interesting point, I think. This is where I feel that people just do not see bet enough. Like I don't see people see betting enough, especially with queen 2, jack 2, 10 2. These are the best hands to be starting a bluff with. Basically the 2 is the bottom of our range, so this will be the bottom of our range, and we're unblocking a lot of their hands that can fold to a c-bet and barrels, because they're going to be calling a lot with a gut shot or something, and then they're just going to be folding to barrels. So whenever you bet with these combos, we're going to be able to barrel them off quite often. And then again with hands like 10-8, Jack-8, I feel like they're generally checking them back more. And so, since they are checking them back more, again, it's going to be favoring donking rather than not donking. So, overall, since we gain quite a bit of EV by donking. That's good. We also get more value because they're not c-betting enough. They're like c-betting like they should against someone who's not donking in general. And so we get more value, and we also deny equity with our value hands. Like if we have a 7, for example, we're going to be getting a lot of value with those. And we see against GTO, even if we use only a full pot donk, which is a pretty large sizing, 7s are betting more often than not overall. So definitely a lot of value to be gotten. Even King 4 and Queen 4 are going to be donking at some frequency. People will generally be c-betting too much value. Like they'll be c-betting maybe all of their 2 pairs here, maybe 100% of their top pairs. And actually, if we look here, they're going to be c-betting more of their 2 pairs and more of their top pairs, and they'll be bluffing less. So again, like their strategy as a default, people's default strategy here is actually going to be really good against us if we don't have a donking range, I think. So it again, favoring donking, and people can play wrong against the donk as well. Like if we do donk, they're going to start making mistakes. Maybe they won't be folding ace-king or ace-queen or king-queen. Maybe they're not going to be folding like enough of their gut shots. Maybe they're not going to be folding enough 4s. Like against a pot-sized donk, they need to fold 100% of their 3s, you know? So again, people can make mistakes against the donk, and so I think it's a really good idea. Also, they won't be raising. I mean, they will be raising too much. Maybe they're going to raise all their jacks, queens, kings, aces. Maybe they're going to raise like some sets. Maybe they're going to raise some 2 pairs. Like sets, straights, 2 pairs, over pairs, they shouldn't be raising that much, basically. Yeah, I think they'll do fine with top pairs, but they'll probably raise too much of their top range. And like maybe they'll, I don't know, maybe they'll have enough bluffs or not. I'm not sure about the bluffs. Maybe they'll raise like, but maybe they'll bluff with the wrong hands. Maybe they'll bluff with a hand like 9-8 suited, more, I don't know, some 2 overcards plus backdoors rather than gut shots. So again, just favors donking if they play wrong against our donk, in addition to all the previous mistakes to make. The main things that we point out that we may not want to donk is basically that it becomes harder for us to play our strategy, right? And we're going to need to know how to continue on turns and rivers, and so our strategy becomes more complicated, but that's the main drawback, and it makes our checking range weaker. But that the fact that it makes our checking range weaker, since we're donking, isn't going to be much of an issue if they're not c-betting enough. And you know, people should actually be c-betting quite a lot on these flops, like 50% c-betting range. It's pretty high, I think. Yeah, so overall, I think it's worth it to learn a donking strategy, and that's why I did decide to include a donk strategy. And I think it's important to learn what donk strategy we want to use. So then the next question becomes, what sizing do I want to use for my donks, right? And so the sizing I would want to use would be something between a min bet and an overbet, basically. And I thought maybe we might want to incorporate some more overbets, because then it allows us to just jam on the turn, but it appears that that's just not the case. Also, against an overbet, the play is pretty simple. Well, actually, it's not that simple. They probably won't be jamming like 4s, but they get to fold much easier with like ace-king, for example. So I decided not to look at the overbet, and I wanted to figure out what would be the best sizing to use out of 1 big blind, 1.5 big blinds, or 2 big blinds, so half pot, 3/4, or full pot. And here we see I decided just for this, I decided to pick 1.5 big blind in position c-bet. Won't make a big difference. And notice also, if he's using only one sizing, his frequency of bets increases even more. Like we see 52% c-bet with only one sizing of 3/4 pot. Here he's using multiple sizings, and because of that, because he's got a large bet, like a 2 big blind bet, and he's mixing his ranges, he can c-bet less even in GTO with a donk. People should be c-betting even more, basically, than this, which is quite sick. So we see how if we use different sizings, the frequencies of strategies also change. And since most people do use only one sizing or maybe two sizings, or like, I think in this spot, most people either use one sizing or they use mostly one sizing. Like 90% of the times they will use one sizing, but then maybe like the 10% of the time that they have something like, I don't know, pocket eights or like a strong 7, they're just going to increase sizing because they know that's the type of hand that wants to go large. And maybe they'll increase sizing occasionally with a bluff, like once in a while, like a gut shot or something. But I don't think it's like they studied it really, Most people haven't. And so if people only use one sizing, the c-bet frequency increases, especially if it's only one big blind sizing, which isn't even that much. And we're going to see one big blind can c-bet even more. Actually, maybe I'll try to find a sim I ran with one big blind only to see how big the difference is. One big blind in position bet is there. So you see, I did just in order to create the strategy, I ran all these sims just to find out what strategy we want to use, because I knew once I found my strategy, then I could basically copy this strategy for every other flop, basically. So let's see, one big blind donk here. So this is a strategy where there's a 3/4 pot donk, and in position is betting one big blind. And we see if the only bet sizing is one big blind, which is what a lot of people are using, they should be betting even 60% of the time. So, against somebody who's not donking, people are betting like, let's say, 40% of the time, which is correct. I mean, against someone who's not donking, like they are playing a low c-bet frequency, and it's going to be good against us because we're not donking. Against someone who is donking, they should be c-betting 60% of the time if they're using one big blind only. They're not betting nearly enough, I don't think. Like over here in this sim, they're betting more of these random 2-over cards, like Jack 9 suited, Jack 9 off, Queen 9 off, Queen 10 off. They're betting so many more of these random 2-over cards. They actually decrease the frequency with these Queen 2, Jack 2 type of hands, because these types of hands are good in a larger bet because they're intending to fold out like some gut shots or like bottom pairs. But if we use a min bet, they never fold a bottom pair, and they probably don't fold too many gut shots. Like they fold some gut shots, but basically not too many. Like most of the gut shots still call. And so if they use a one big blind strategy only, they should have a very high frequency of c-betting, like 60% c-bet frequency if we're not donking on this board. And so this is why it's important to study this, because you might look in Insta GTO or like GTO base or some GTO database basically, and you might just see the solution, and you might see that you might see that you might see that GTO is c-betting 48% of the time, but that's because it's using multiple sizings, and there's a donking range. If there wasn't a donking range, it would c-bet less than this. So it can be easy to look at this and think, well, I see people maybe bet here with ace jack, or I don't know, jack nine suited, or some of these hands, king two off, which they should be. But then, you make it one big blind only, and they should be betting even more. So, just because GTO is using one frequency of 50% or 50%, but multiple sizings, if GTO was using only one sizing with with its range, then a lot of people would all of a sudden be way under c-betting now. So that's why it's important to actually try to figure out what other people are playing also and what's their strategy. And so, it just made so much more sense to me to have a donking range, because I don't think people are betting on these flops nearly enough. Like, they should be betting 3/4 of their gut shots. I think they're not betting 3/4 of them, maybe like half of them, maybe not even that much. Again, they should be betting like random king highs on the flop, which again people are just not doing. I think people are checking back most of their king highs like this, Same with queen highs. They should be betting queen 8, queen 9. I think people are generally checking back most of their queen highs. I can see people bluffing jack highs, but that's what they should be if we were were donking. Yeah, but if we were not donking, they should be checking more of those back. And I think they'll be checking back still quite a lot, but yeah, I don't think they'll be betting like all the time with jack 8, or like 75% of the time with like all of these 8s basically. Yeah, so then we wanted to ask what is the best donk sizing to use basically. But yeah, I just wanted to explain why, just looking at the GTO solution isn't going to tell you whether population is over c-betting or not, because you can't know that unless you try to implement their strategy, which I think at these stack depth, not many people use more than one big blind, basically. Let's see. So the best donking sizing, let's move on to that. I think, so here we have all the different donk sizings, and we ruled out 3 big blinds immediately just from that. So now we should compare the different donk sizings. And so for that I kept all the I kept the in position sizing to 1 big blind here, as we see. But then I used some different donk sizings. So we had 1.5 BB donk and 1 big blind in position. We had 1 big blind donk and 1 BB in position c-bet. We had 2 big blind donk and 1 BB in position c-bet. And so I wanted to find what was the best donk strategy again. So let's look at them, and we see 2 big blinds, 1.5, 1 big blind, and I left out 3 big blinds. I mean, I did calculate it just because I was curious, But yeah, it's just not very practical to look at it since it's never used, and the solution's not too hard. So one big blind donk. It's down here. As we see, if we're using one big blind donk, well, in that case, we should be donking at a high frequency of 32%, and it's very complicated to remember this. We should be donking everything with frequencies, pretty much, like any equity hand. Like if we have any 7, we should donk sometimes, but not always. We should donk like 9-8 suited, Jack-8 suited, with backdoors with some frequency. We should donk our gut shots with some frequency. We should donk our 4s and 3s with some frequency. And I just found that really impractical because I'm not very likely to donk a 4 or a 3. I'm just saying, it's not intuitive to me to be donking a 4 or a 3, and so I found this extremely difficult. And whilst the EV, well, the EV is not even better, right? So yeah, basically the EV is the same as with a pot size donk, about, and slightly worse than a 1.5 big blind donk. So given that I didn't like this strategy too much of donking only one big blind, because the EV didn't make a difference, and it's also the most complicated strategy. So these two strategies are much simpler. So 1.5 big blind donk, 2 big blind donk, the frequencies go down considerably. The frequency here is 19%. It's much more intuitive what you want to donk. You want to donk your top pairs. You want to check your second and third pairs, unless you have king 4 or queen 4 offsuit. That's not too hard to remember. And you can donk as a bluff with your gut shots sometimes, and occasionally the hands you really don't want to check call, 9-8 suited, 10-8 suited, etc. With a backdoor flush draw or something. Those make decent hands to be donking as well as a bluff. Here again, it's also not too complicated. We're not donking many of our 4s. We'll donk king 4 and queen 4 offsuit again, and 6-4 and 5-4 sometimes. But we're not donking like 9-4, 10-4. It's donking at like 10% frequency. If you just don't donk them at all, it won't make a big difference. We will be donking quite often with 7s. That's very intuitive. And we're still donking with 9-8, 10-8 suited, Jack-8 suited type of backdoor flush draw plus backdoor straight draw air type of hands. And so that's pretty intuitive as well. So basically, I thought it would be a face-off between 1.5 big blinds and 2 big blinds for a donk strategy. And, the EV was slightly higher here for out of position. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for out of position, this donking strategy, to be 1.5 big blinds, basically. But in order to look at this, to confirm this, we also had to look at their reaction against our donk. So basically, if we bet full pot, they'll have an easier time to fold these like ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen type of hands. Here they should, like against 1.5 big blinds, they'll have a much easier time to call them. I think, GTO is still folding them a good percentage. Like the GTO is still folding it over 75% of the time. I think against 1.5 big blinds, people might start to call them more. They also here against 2 big blinds donks, they should be raising with more 7s actually. Here it's a smaller donk, and so it's not worth it for them to just take the pot down and win that money. So they want to slow play more of their 7s. They want to just call with Jack-7 and 10-7. Here, Jack-7, 10-7, even 9-7 off is a pure raise. I think people will be raising against donks quite often, even against a 2 big blind donk. And they should raise. they should also raise like Jack 5, 10, 5. Okay, I don't think they'll do that, but yeah. They should be folding their threes against both players, but I think against 1.5 big blind, they might call almost all threes. Against 2 big blinds, they'll start to fold some, but they'll probably still call like some of them. Maybe they'll call like half of them or something. I don't know. So this is a spot where maybe it's better to go 2 big blinds for the threes. With gut shots, I'm really not sure how they'll play. They probably will fold too much with like 10-8 suited, Jack-8 suited with a backdoor flush draw against both players. Like these type of hands are much better to call against a donk than like these, like a 3 or a gut shot. Because you've got 2 overcards, so, 10-8 is amazing to call because you can turn, you can turn a pair firstly, with 2 overcards. But even if you don't turn a pair, any 9, any Jack, any 5, it gives you like an out. It gives you a draw. Any like flush draw, it's going to give you a draw. So it's really good. It's really good to call with hands like 10-8, Jack-8 suited. Any 2 overs or ace with a backdoor flush draw should be called, basically. Yeah, so it was pretty close between what sizing I thought would be best, but I decided to pick 1.5 big blinds because I think they'll still be making enough mistakes, and the EV was, it was just a bit slightly higher. So I don't think it's a big difference, though, between these 2 sizings. So the next question we need to ask is, all right, we've determined that 1.5 big blind is the best donking sizing to use. But now we need to ask, what is the best sizing for in position to c-bet? Because, it's a connected board. Maybe we want to be putting in a bit more money. So I looked at a few other situations. So I picked 1.5 big blinds, as we see, and then I used all the different sizings. And I even used 2 sizings, just in case. So let's open 1.5 and 1 big blind, 1.5 and 1.5, big blind in position, 1.5 and 2 big blinds, and we got this, maybe 1.5 and 2 sizings, even though that's impractical. So here we have 2 sizings. It's actually a good strategy. It's just too difficult, I think. Like, I don't want to be using 2 sizings on this board because it, like, heads up is fast and it's going to make our strategy so difficult that we're going to have to reduce tables to implement this. And whilst the EV was good and it kind of makes sense, it's again, like I'm sure if I spent a lot of time studying this, I could start to implement it, but I'd rather start off with a simple strategy, and I don't know, maybe after I've figured out everything for all other possible boards, which probably won't be for a very long time, I could try to start implementing this. But I'd have to be like probably one of the best players in the entire world to be able to even consider implementing this. So I just found this kind of impractical, even though it had a very good EV. We see this is 2 big blinds only. The EV here for in position is considerably better. It's like 8% better. Here the EV for 1 big blind, again, it's a bit better than 1 big blind only. This is 1.5 big blinds, so it's about the same EV as 1.5 big blinds only. So it was actually interesting to see that 1.5 big blind only had a slight EV advantage. I mean, it's like a 2% EV advantage over one big blind only. 2% is really tiny, so yeah, it's not going to make too much of a difference. Um, but um, it's also not too hard to remember. So, basically, when looking at the EVs, I figured that this two big blind only c-bet had a pretty large EV loss overall compared to the other two. Like if we compare 1.146 to 1.139, it's like a 7% EV loss. That's a pretty big EV loss. So when I saw that EV loss, I just thought I do not want to use a two big blind sizing on this flop at this stack depth. So then the two choices had to be between these two, basically. And we can look at the strategies now. Obviously, we will see bet less with a 1.5 big blind sizing, about half the time compared to 60% of the time. That's if somebody is donking. But we're just creating our own strategy right now. And it's a lot easier to remember that we don't need to bluff any of these 2-over cards with backdoor flush draw, like suited 2-over cards, but we do need to bluff 9-8 off, 10-8 off, Jack-9 off, etc. Here we need to bluff sometimes with 2-over cards plus backdoor flush draw. That's against somebody who is donking. So our range will be a bit more polar here. We do get to bet more with Queen Deuce, Jack 2, 10-2 off here, because we're going to fold more of his gut shots. He's going to have to fold like a lot of these gut shots. Here he's going to have to call a lot of his gut shots. But the thing is, in reality, I think people will still be calling too many gut shots here. So we're not achieving as much by betting with the Jack 2 off type of hands. So actually, again, is kind of less practical. So overall, I don't know. It's really close again between these two strategies, but I decided to pick one big blind because, like here, I think people fold Jack 8 of of clubs. They fold Jack 8 of spades as a default. And even against one big blind. So I think people will still be overfolding too many of their backdoor flush draws, plus 2-over cards. And, we can also look one big blind only. Okay, one big blind only, no donk. This is it, right? Yeah. So if they never donk, they should start to fold some bottom pairs. Like here, they are donking, and so their bottom pairs are much stronger in their part of the range because they're donking sevens, and so they have to call every bottom pair once they're donking. If they're not donking, they need to fold a lot of gut shots. They need to fold a lot of threes, and all of a sudden, it becomes even better for us to use one big blind only if they're not donking, because they're not going to be folding enough, basically. So yeah, I thought it would actually make sense to stick with one big blind, because firstly, I've been using one big blind at the stack depth only for like a while. Secondly, like, we are at a shallow stack depth, so no matter what sizing that we use on the flop, we're going to be able to like get the money in by the river without needing to overbet on any street. We can bet one big blind here, like 3/4 or even like 2.5 big blinds, like 66% on the turn, and then we can jam the river without having any overbet. So Also, from a stack to pot ratio perspective, it doesn't make much sense to increase our sizing. And so I thought in overall strategy types of terms, like a holistic view of our entire strategy, where we choose only one sizing for our entire strategy on across all different board textures, not just straight possible ones, but on every single board at like 11 big blinds or like below 14 big blinds or whatever threshold we want to use. Just one big blind only for shallower stacks basically makes a lot of sense. Taking a holistic view at our entire strategy, it's also going to simplify things considerably for us once again. And so for that reason, I thought one big blind only as our only strategy would be, as our only sizing would be our strategy. So that was the conclusion for how I created my strategy, and we ended up with a strategy of 1.5 big blind donking. So this is our strategy now, 1.5 big blind donking and one big blind c-bet in position. And this is the strategy that we would use. However, when looking at how we actually want to play, we may want to look at no donk, because a lot of people are not donking enough. And so if they never donk, you know, here we're betting 60%, here we're betting 40% if they never donk. If they have zero donking range, we should be lowering our c-bet considerably. And I think this is how a lot of people play in reality. And that's why it makes sense for us to be donking. But playing against others, it makes sense for us to be c-betting less than we should be in GTO. And so that's what we're going to be analyzing and researching over the coming days and weeks. And then I did a bunch of node locks. So I put someone who is c-betting different. In general, c-bet different just means c-betting too much. I mean, too little, like he would be against someone who's donking. I did also calling too much or raising different against the donk, because I think people will be calling against the donk more than GTO or our GTO strategy. Like I think they'll be calling more ace king, they'll be calling more threes, they'll be calling more gut shots, etc. And maybe they'll raise too many sevens, stuff like that. Or two pairs, they might raise their two pairs and sets or something. So yeah, I did a bunch of node locking for each possible flop. And ours, it basically means our strategy. So our strategy is a pseudo GTO strategy, but we're also going to analyze it from a node locking exploitative perspective. And then, so I created a ton of flops. I think it's 5, 10, it's almost 20 flops. Maybe it is 20 flops. It looks like 18 or 19, 20, I don't know. But anyway, I created a ton of different flops, and then, you know, for each different flop, I've got our strategy, and then I've got node locks as well. Yeah, it's sick. So our strategy and node locks for each different flops, I got. So, you know, I for each of these, I had to run like 4 sims or something. And then we got rainbow flops, we got monotone flops and suited flops. I didn't do as many node locks for suited ones, and for monotone I didn't do any yet, because I found that we don't need a donking strategy on monotone flops. But yeah, this is what I want to analyze over the coming weeks, and this is how I went about creating my strategy. And so you see, I just wanted to show this to show why it's important to have our own strategy that we use to simplify things for us. Because if we just have our own default strategy, it's already starting to exploit the population. Like, we created this strategy because we think this is the strategy that's going to exploit the population as a default. If we just try to play exactly the strategy, as a default, it's going to exploit the population. But we're going to get into that even more with like the node locks and how we can exploit even more, basically. But this is already like a pseudo GTO strategy, basically. Simplified GTO. And as we see, the simplified GTO strategy can look quite different from a GTO strategy. So again, you know, like just because we have one sizing, I think the GTO strategy, yeah, here we had a two big blind donk. And then multiple in position sizings. But we see the GTO strategy, like there's already a 12% difference in c-bet frequency. Like it's a big difference. And so you can't just look in a GTO database like Insta-GTO and assume you're playing correctly if you use a different sizing choice, basically. Because maybe you look at this and you decide, all right, these are the hands I want to be betting, but then you only pick one sizing. But if you, as soon as you pick only one sizing, your entire strategy needs to change. Like you need to start betting with Queen 8, Jack 8, 9, 8 suited, like a ton of the times. You need to start checking back King 2 off and Queen 2 off more often. Stuff like that, basically. You need to bet Ace King 100% of the time, etc., etc. So, yeah, that's why it's important also to create our own strategies and not just look through like something like Insta-GTO or something. Anyways, I think that's it for today. I hope it was useful and it shows the process I go through in order to create my own strategy. And in the future, we will be looking through all the different flop subsets of straight possible boards at the stack depth and our strategy, as well as some node locks, and we're going to try to find some more exploits, and we will try to find some cool, maybe little details that we don't have enough time to do right now or something, but yeah, cool. Oh, maybe I'd like to show all the flops. So basically, these are the boards I analyzed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 flops, each with different node locks. These are some questions I would like to ask, some node locks I would like to do. I did most of the node locks already, and now it's time to look at the questions and the research, basically. This is already done. Yeah, and so, alright, I think that's enough.